Story 1. Virginia Hall has a building named after her at the Central Intelligence Agency. She was an American from Baltimore who went to Europe in the 1930s, lost her leg in a shooting accident, and went on to become a leader in the French resistance and a master of disguise, all with a wooden leg. The book titled A Woman of No Importance is about her and was published last year. Story 2. Anna Connolly invented the fire escape in 1887. In the same year, Josephine Cochrane invented the dishwasher. Story 3. Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha is the Dean of Medicine at Hurley Children's Hospital in Flint, Michigan. She observed that children were exhibiting elevated blood lead levels outside the normal range. She contacted the Genesee Department of Health, which at first dismissed her claim, and then provided obfuscated data intended to show that the elevated blood lead levels were within expected trends. Frustrated, she called a team of epidemiologists from Virginia Tech, her alma mater, to identify the source of the lead. They found that the water in multiple postal code areas was contaminated with lead. She informed the Genesee Department of Health again, which dismissed her, so she held a major press conference and announced that the water in Flint was unsafe. She urged parents to bring their children to the hospital for testing and to pick up supplies of bottled water and liquid infant formula. Her actions helped prevent thousands of children from suffering the permanent effects of lead poisoning. Correction. It was Virginia Tech, not the University of Virginia. Apologies to Virginia Tech alumni who direct messaged me. Story 4. Marie Tharp created the first map of the ocean floor, which led to the discovery of tectonic plates and the development of the theory of continental drift. Story 5. Inga Lehmann was a Danish seismologist. She discovered P-prime waves that reflect off the inner core, confirming that the Earth has a solid inner core and a liquid outer core. Story 6. Carol Kaye, the first lady of bass playing, played over 10,000 sessions, including on albums by Frank Sinatra, the Beach Boys, Stevie Wonder, and the Monkees. I can thank the marvelous Mrs. Maisel and the Reddit community for educating me about her. Story 7. Dr. Georgiana Seeger-Jones. Dr. Jones single-handedly organized the field of gynecological endocrinology. While at Johns Hopkins with her husband, Dr. Howard Jones, and Drs. Roberts and Steptoe, she devised the hypothesis of follicular hyperstimulation, which produced more than one egg per cycle. Her later discoveries increased the viability of in vitro fertilization. According to Wikipedia, as a resident at Johns Hopkins, she discovered that the pregnancy hormone human chorionic gonadotropin was manufactured by the placenta, not the pituitary gland as originally thought. This discovery led to the development of many of the early, over-the-counter pregnancy test kits. In 1949, Jones made the first description of luteal phase dysfunction and is credited as the first to use progesterone to treat women with a history of miscarriages, allowing many of them to conceive and deliver healthy babies. She also served as a dean of the College of Pontifical Sciences, advising the Vatican on matters of gynecology and conception. Her husband always said she is the smarter one. She was an absolute gem. My mother-in-law was with the Jones Institute from its inception. The Drs. Jones were truly remarkable people. Story 8. In 1952, Dr. Virginia Apgar developed a quick, easy 5-point test that summarizes the health of newborns and identifies those needing emergency assistance. The Apgar score is now given to nearly every newborn and has helped save countless young lives and reduce infant mortality. Story 9. Frances Oldham Kelsey stopped thalidomide from becoming widely used in North America and saved countless children from life-altering birth defects. Story 10. Allied codebreakers at places like Bletchley Park during World War II worked long, tedious, and stressful hours and were major contributors to the war effort and military intelligence. Their work did not receive official recognition from the British government until 2009, 64 years after the war ended. Story 11. Sandra Ford was the drug technician who first brought attention to what would later become the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome epidemic. She realized something was wrong when she began receiving an unusually high number of requests for pentamidine, an antibiotic reserved for treating pneumocystis pneumonia in seriously ill, immunocompromised patients. The patients for whom it was requested were gay men who had previously been healthy. Story 12. Claudette Cole then refused to give up her seat on a bus during the Jim Crow era in the United States. Because she was unmarried and pregnant at the time, civil rights leaders decided she was not a suitable public image and selected Rosa Parks to do the same. Story 13. Bessie Coleman was a black woman who wanted to fly. No one in the United States would teach her, but flight schools in France would, so she moved to France, learned French and how to fly. She returned to the United States and taught anyone who wanted to learn. She lived at the same time as Amelia Earhart but received little recognition then. Story 14. Elsie McGill, also known as the Queen of the Hurricanes, was the world's first woman to earn an aeronautical engineering degree. She designed the Maple Leaf Trainer II and oversaw manufacturing operations at Canadian factories that built the Hawker Hurricane. Story 15. For Scotland, I would say the Edinburgh Seven. They paved the way for women to attend university in the United Kingdom. Story 16. Cecilia Pangaposhkin discovered what the universe is made of but does not even get a mention in textbooks. Story 17. King Tamara of Georgia. She now represents the Georgian nation in Civilization VI, but before that few people knew about her. Whenever she is mentioned she is referred to as a queen, yet she was given the title of king because she was recognized as an equal monarch. Her husbands did not hold royal titles. This is an undisputed fact in Georgian historiography. I do not know about Western scholars, but on the internet and in mainstream sources, whether on Wikipedia or in video games such as Civilization VI, she is often denied her lawful title, and that frustrates me. Story 18. Chiang Ai-saw, also known as Ching Shi, was the single most successful pirate in history. She led an armada of tens of thousands of sailors and 17 separate fleets of ships, and held a major Chinese tributary under attack for weeks before slipping past a combined force of Portuguese, Chinese, and British warships after being cornered in an inlet with 2 damaged ships and no way out but through. After this venture, she recognized that her power was beginning to wane, so she decided to cash out while she still had leverage, as one of her fleets had turned on her. She negotiated amnesty for all of her men, permission for them to join the Chinese Navy, the right to keep their plunder, and permission for her to retain several ships to enter the salt trade. She then ran a gambling house and died peacefully in her sleep. Beyond being a remarkable story, her domination of the Chinese Navy exposed how much the empire had neglected that branch of the military, and the British took note. It contributed to their willingness to wage naval war across the globe at a time when messages could take a year or more to travel. The Opium Wars and the treaties that followed are referred to by the current Chinese government as the start of the century of humiliation, and they are a major touchstone in the government's self-image. They are invoked today when negotiations with the West break down as a reason that China should not yield to outside pressure. For any Canadians, of whom I am one, it is on the level of Vimy Ridge in our national consciousness. Story 19. Irina Sendler worked with others to smuggle Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II. Story 20. Daphne Oram was the first composer to produce electronic sound. She pioneered electronic music and paved the way for today's music. She wrote a piece titled Still Point, which she could not perform live due to sexism from her peers and never heard before she died. It was performed for the first time in 2018 using a replica of a machine she had created to manipulate an orchestra electronically. Story 21. Belva Lockwood was one of the first female lawyers in the United States and ran for president in the 1880s. Story 22. Agent 355 was the code name of one of the first American spies. Her true identity is still unknown. Some historians dispute whether she was an actual person or a code used when a woman provided useful intelligence. If so, Agent 355 could have been multiple women who had a significant influence on events during the founding of the United States. Story 23. Henrietta Leavitt was an astronomer at Harvard who discovered a type of star called a Cepheid. Cepheid stars pulsate at predictable rates, which allows us to determine their distances. Because of her work, we were able to measure the size of the universe and learn many other things about its properties. Story 24. Nellie Bly was a journalist in the 1890s who was assigned to investigate the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island after accusations of patient mistreatment. She gained admission by faking insanity and having herself committed. After her release, she published an exposé in the New York World called 10 Days in a Madhouse that revealed the terrible treatment of patients. The story was considered a revolution in investigative journalism. After reading around the world in 80 days, she decided she could do it faster and traveled around the world in 72 days. She was also an inventor and a leading journalist covering the suffrage movement. She is one of my favorite historical figures who does not get enough attention. Story 25. Mary Anderson invented the windshield wiper in 1903. As soon as the patent expired, it became standard in all cars. She attempted to sell the invention while she held the patent, but most manufacturers refused to see its value, and her gender likely influenced their lack of enthusiasm. Story 26. Temple Grandin, who despite being diagnosed with autism at the age of 4 in 1954, when autism often led to institutionalization, went on to transform the livestock industry and is still alive today to tell the story. Story 27. Eleanor Marx, perhaps overlooked because of her father, played an important role in British trade unions, which helped reduce the working week from 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Those extra hours to go for a walk, play video games, learn something new, or just relax represent a significant improvement. Story 28. Cicely Saunders deserves the reputation Mother Teresa has. She essentially invented the modern hospice movement. Before her, doctors often abandoned patients with incurable illnesses to die without palliative care. She arguably relieved more needless suffering than anyone else. Story 29. Henrietta Lacks. She saved millions of lives and made a critical contribution to medicine, but unless you are in the medical field, you have probably never heard her name. Henrietta Lacks was a young black mother of 5 when she died in 1951 after being diagnosed with aggressive cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins. Dr. George Guy was working at Johns Hopkins at the time, trying to culture cells in the laboratory. Lacks' cells were among dozens sent to his lab, but they were the first to ever survive and grow. Her cells, a unique and aggressive type, were later described as 1 in 3 billion. Scientists called these resilient cells Henrietta Lacks cells. The short name came from the first 2 letters of Henrietta and Lacks. The cells were used to test the polio vaccine, to help develop in vitro fertilization, and to develop several chemotherapy drugs among hundreds of medical advances. Grown and sold around the world, Lacks' legacy lived on in her cells. They traveled to space and were even embedded in a nuclear bomb. For decades, the Lacks family had no idea. Story 30. Camille Claudel was a sculptor who worked with Auguste Rodin. He took credit for some of her work. Artemisia Gentileschi was a Baroque painter whose style was similar to Caravaggio. She is far less well known than he is and painted Judith slaying Holofernes. These are brief recollections from art school. Many talented women have been overlooked by the male-dominated narratives of art history. Story 31. Frances Perkins was the first female cabinet member in the United States. She was appointed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt and played a key role in the New Deal, working for better working conditions, child labor laws, and women's rights. Story 32. Mary Todd Lincoln. She later suffered from mental illness, which was not entirely her fault. She pushed her husband, Abraham Lincoln, to advance in politics and ultimately helped shape the role of the First Lady of the United States. He might not have become president without her influence. She had more ambition than he did. She also enjoyed baking. Her almond cake was reportedly one of her husband's favorite desserts. Story 33. Madam C. J. Walker developed hair care products for black women and marketed them through the business she founded, becoming the first female self-made millionaire. Story 34. The woman who painted the first lane markings on roads did it because she had almost been in an accident one night and did not want it to happen to anyone else. Story 35. Sister Rosetta Tharpe was highly influential to early rock musicians such as Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Elvis Presley, and Jerry Lee Lewis. Johnny Cash said she was his favorite singer. She was one of the first to experiment with heavy distortion on the electric guitar. Some call her the godmother of rock and roll, yet many people have never heard of her. A compilation of her film guitar solos is available on YouTube. Story 36. Hypatia made an astrolabe. She was later murdered by a Christian mob. The circular saw was invented by a woman. Thank you. I do not know her name. Story 37. Clara Barton helped obtain medical supplies during the American Civil War and later founded the American Red Cross. She is a legend in my book. Story 38. Lise Meitner was a Jewish physicist who worked with Otto Hahn on research into radioactivity. She fled Nazi Germany, continued her work in Sweden, and helped discover nuclear fission. Although Hahn received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the discovery, Meitner was part of the research. She was offered work on the Manhattan Project but refused because she opposed nuclear weapons. The element meitnerium was named for her after her death. Story 39. Rosalind Franklin. Watson and Crick used her research to determine the double helix structure of deoxyribonucleic acid. They were awarded the Nobel Prize for that discovery. By the time her contribution was fully recognized, she had already died of cancer. Her work with X-rays had exposed her to excessive radiation. The Nobel Committee has acknowledged her contribution but cannot award a prize posthumously. Story 40. Michelle Mouton. It is just auto racing, not super important in the grand scheme of things, but she was incredible. She was probably the best rally driver and hill climb driver of her era and one of the best ever. She was also instrumental in advancing all-wheel drive racing and improving safety standards. She raced in the Group B class, which required a level of skill and courage and involved a disregard for safety that has rarely, if ever, been matched. Story 41. May I recommend a series of short YouTube videos by Sandy Toksvig called Vox Talks. She is a delightful United Kingdom television personality, and during the lockdown earlier this year she made several dozen videos about overlooked women in history. Story 42. I am an astronomer. The foundations for modern astrophysics and our understanding of the universe did not come from the preeminent astronomers of the 19th century, but from a group of women known as the Harvard Computers at the Harvard College Observatory. At the time, only men were allowed to use the telescopes, and Harvard was experimenting with early astrophotography, so they hired women to examine those first images. Those women made the first discoveries about hydrogen spectral lines in stars, spectroscopic binaries, two stars orbiting so closely they cannot be resolved by eye, and about 500,000 variable stars, some of which were used as standard candles to determine the size of the universe. This work occurred decades before electronic computers and before computer technology relied on electricity. Two of the women were deaf. One of my favorites is Williamina Fleming, who led the group. She began as a single mother working as a maid for the observatory director. When he criticized his male students' analysis of the images and said, "My maid could do better," she proved him wrong. Fleming ran the group, discovered many variable stars and nebulae, and discovered a supernova 1895b, which I studied in research I published this year. In her spare time she made dolls and was friends with Andrew Carnegie's family. These were remarkable astronomers. I work at the same place today, the Harvard Observatory, and I was fortunate to tour the 500,000 glass photographic plates from that era. At the time, exposures were made on glass photographic plates rather than on paper. Story 43. Not sure if this is major, but this woman was my dad's aunt. She was the first female chemist at Dow Chemical. I heard a lot about her but never got to meet her. Story 44. Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth were both remarkable women, but few people mention the National Association of Colored Women and the important support it provided to them and to the civil rights movement. Story 45. Dolores Huerta is a co-founder of the United Farm Workers Union with Cesar Chavez, active in the 1960s. She is a civil rights activist who advocated for immigrant workers' rights by organizing boycotts of grape growers. Farm workers were exposed to dangerous pesticides, poor working conditions, and low pay. Her determination has changed the landscape of workers' rights and influenced many to stand up against unfair treatment and discrimination. She has historically lived in the shadow of Chavez, but now receives greater recognition for her involvement in numerous social justice movements. She is a civil rights icon and should receive the credit she deserves. Story 46. Emmy Noether. I do not understand what she did, but leading mathematicians say her work was groundbreaking, so I will take their word for it. Story 47. Madam C. J. Walker is finally starting to get recognition. Story 48. Big Mama Thornton. She sang the hit Hound Dog a few years before Elvis Presley made it popular, but I believe because of the color of her skin she could not get as much recognition. I still prefer her version to Elvis Presley. Story 49. Globally, perhaps Kate Shepherd is the best known. She led the women's suffrage movement in New Zealand when that country became the first in the world to grant women the right to vote. Locally, she is acknowledged by appearing on our $10 note, but globally few people know of her or the impact she had on democracies worldwide. Story 50. Ella Baker is one of the most overlooked Americans of the 20th century. She brought grassroots organizing to small towns and rural communities across the country to advance the civil rights movement and helped students create key organizations such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Modern American grassroots politics result from her efforts and leadership. Story 51. I forgot the name of the woman who handwrote all the math that made the moon landing possible. Story 52. Artemisia Gentileschi was one of the most prolific artists of the 17th century. Judith slaying Holofernes is probably her most recognizable painting. At a time when women were not encouraged or allowed in the male-dominated art world, she became a professional by age 15, worked in many places, and was the first woman accepted into the Art Academy in Florence. She took her rapist to court, and he was found guilty after a 7-month trial. She had no time for female submissiveness, which is reflected in her art. Her story is remarkable and her art is utterly compelling. Story 53. Jane Addams. She was a major reformer in the early 1900s and is considered a founder of social work. She established settlement houses, most famously Hull House in Chicago. She was instrumental in advancing women's rights and the roles women played, efforts that helped lead to women's right to vote. She focused on ways women could be central to community building, and many of her ideas remain influential today. Story 54. Anne Sexton's birthday is today. She is often seen as the mother of postmodern poetry. Story 55. I might be late to the party, but Harriet Beecher Stowe is an integral figure in American history. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, exposing the cruel reality of slavery to the American public. Story 56. One of the most famous pirates to have lived was Anne Bonny, a member of Calico Jack's crew. She was an extremely skilled fighter feared by many. Story 57. Soviet female soldiers of World War II. The Soviet Union used women in World War II more than any other country. I feel that this and the Soviet Union's involvement as a whole is too often overlooked. Edit. I replaced Russian with Soviet and apologize for the mistake. Story 58. Ida B. Wells. Many people do not know her name, and that is disappointing. Ida B. Wells was born a slave and freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Her parents died, and she first worked as a teacher to support her family. Later, she co-owned the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight newspaper and reported incidents of racial segregation and inequality. Lynchings of black people in the southern United States in the 1890s were often treated as unimportant. Wells exposed these crimes, often risking her life, receiving death threats, and once losing her printing press and office to a white mob that warned her never to return to Memphis. She showed that lynching was a barbaric practice used by white people in the South to intimidate African Americans who created economic and political competition and threatened white power. Wells began investigating after the owners of a black store, Thomas Moss, William Stewart, and Calvin McDowell, faced violent conflict with a competing white-owned store. A fight between a black boy, Armour Harris, and a white boy, Cornelius Hearst, escalated when Hearst's father intervened. Store employees went outside to defend Harris, and a mob formed. The white store owner, Barrett, arrived the next day with a deputy looking for Stewart. A confrontation left McDowell arrested. In March, a group of white men was met with a barrage of bullets from Moss's store, wounding the sheriff and a civilian. Moss, Stewart, and McDowell were arrested, taken from their cells, and lynched. Wells investigated lynchings, arrests, and murders and often wrote about black men being wrongly imprisoned on charges of raping white women. She wrote 2 books, The Red Record and Southern Horrors. Facing continued death threats, she moved to Chicago, married, and raised a family while continuing to write, speak, and organize for civil rights and women's suffrage. Wells was outspoken and faced public disapproval, including from some leaders in the civil rights and women's suffrage movements. She helped establish several women's organizations. During a women's rights march, she refused to be relegated to the back and stood at the front alongside white women. She traveled to Europe twice, including Britain, giving speeches and hoping Americans would follow. She was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, yet her contributions were often downplayed or omitted. She exposed many crimes and injustices that had been ignored. She refused to compromise her principles and insisted on pursuing justice. Story 59. Hetty Green was known as the Witch of Wall Street. She might have gone too far with her frugality, even harming her own family, but she helped many people. Story 60. Simone de Beauvoir was a French writer, intellectual, existentialist philosopher, political activist, feminist, and social theorist. Though she did not consider herself a philosopher, she had a significant influence on both feminist existentialism and feminist theory. Excerpt from Wikipedia. Story 61. Rejected Princesses is a website worth checking out on this topic. Story 62. Sonia Green. As an immigrant single mother living in New York in the early 1900s, she became a successful publisher of several magazines, worked multiple jobs, and earned enough to move herself and her daughter into an upper-middle-class home. She eventually married the reclusive writer Howard Phillips Lovecraft. While she provided financially for her family, she also edited, published, and distributed Lovecraft's work. Through her established magazines and sometimes ghost-wrote material attributed to him, on occasions when he misplaced drafts, she reconstructed stories from memory so they could be published, and at times she developed his ideas into complete pieces. Her contributions were so significant that scholars debate how many stories attributed to Lovecraft were actually written or substantially revised by Green. Green maintained multiple overlapping careers while raising a daughter and later supported and managed Lovecraft's career as well. Arguably, Sonia Green was as responsible for Lovecraft's success as he was. Without her support and editorial work, Lovecraft might have remained a reclusive, little-known figure rather than becoming synonymous with the genre of cosmic horror fiction. Story 63. Beeb Chaudhary. Story 64. For those interested, there is a series called Brazen, an animated adaptation of Penelope Baju's best-selling graphic novel Culottes. Each episode is about 5 minutes long and features women who made notable contributions to their societies and communities. I have seen several episodes and it is quite interesting. Story 65. Livia. She was Augustus' wife and is considered by many to have been the main power behind the throne and a principal reason the Roman Principate formed as it did, shaping history for the next 1,000 years. Story 66. The women of the Special Operations Executive, such as Virginia Hall, a disabled woman who was the first female agent to take up residence in France. She created the Heckler Network in Lyon. Over the next 15 months, she became an expert at support operations, organizing resistance movements, supplying agents with money, weapons, and supplies, helping downed airmen to escape, and offering safe houses and medical assistance to wounded agents and pilots. She fled France in November 1942 to avoid capture by the Germans. She returned to France as a wireless operator for the Office of Strategic Services in March 1944 as a member of the Saint Network. Working in territory still occupied by the German army and mostly without the assistance of other Office of Strategic Services agents, she supplied arms, training, and direction to French resistance groups, called Maquis, especially in Haute-Loire, where the Maquis cleared the department of German soldiers prior to the arrival of the American army in September 1944. By contrast, Ranavalona I, often called the Mad Queen of Madagascar, is regarded by many as one of the most evil queens of all time. Empress Myeongseong is credited with initiating or heavily influencing the modernization of Korea, founding girls' schools, inviting an American physician who introduced modern medicine, modernizing the military, and opening the country to foreign trade, which brought hope for economic improvement. Queen Liliuokalani, the last monarch of Hawaii, is considered by some to be one of the most influential women in Hawaiian history. She resisted the United States' interests in Hawaii, which led to her overthrow and the kingdom's annexation. Today, Hawaii is a state of the United States. Empress Wu Zetian, the only female monarch in Chinese history, influenced military strength, state support for Taoism and Buddhism, education and literature. She had a major impact on the statuary of the Longmen Grottos and the wordless stele at the Qianling Mausoleum, and she commissioned major buildings and bronze castings that no longer survive. Story 67, Edith Wilson. After President Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke, she effectively ran the executive branch for the remainder of his second term. Story 68, Bertha Benz, wife of Carl Benz of Mercedes-Benz, was his first investor, his first product tester, and the first person to take a real road trip. When the brakes started acting up, she stopped at a shoemaker's shop, asked him to cut and fit pieces of leather, and thus became the inventor of brake pads. Story 69, Hypatia, Mary Wollstonecraft, Emily du Châtelet, Olympe de Gouges, Maria Theresa, the Habsburg ruler, Lou Andreas Salome. Some did not necessarily have a huge impact, but it is important to recognize these women for how much they broke the mold. Simply defying gender stereotypes is a major contribution to history. Story 70. Antonieta de Barros was the first black woman elected as a state deputy in Brazil and the first woman deputy in her state, elected in 1935. She was a professor, journalist, and writer. She is remembered for her ability to express ideas within a historical context that did not permit a woman's freedom of expression. Story 71. Kate Sheppard was the most prominent member of the women's suffrage movement in New Zealand, the first nation to grant all women the right to vote in parliamentary elections in 1893. That same year, Elizabeth Yates was elected mayor of Wonhunga, the first woman mayor in the British Empire. She traveled to many other British colonies to help fight for women's rights. Her work and that of other suffragists helped advance equal rights globally. Her image replaced Queen Elizabeth II on the front of the New Zealand $10 note in 1991. Growing up in New Zealand and attending an all-girls school, I was fortunate to learn about this remarkable woman and her passion for equality. I wish more women worldwide knew her name and how she fought for everyone from a small island nation in the Pacific. Story 72. Constance Georgine Markievicz, known as Countess Markievicz, was an Irish politician, revolutionary, nationalist, suffragist, and socialist. She was the first woman elected to the Westminster Parliament and became Minister for Labour in the First Dáil, making her the first female cabinet minister in Europe. She fought in the 1916 Rising in Dublin. On the first day of fighting, she shot a Dublin Metropolitan Police officer dead at St. Stephen's Green. Markievicz was arrested and quickly sentenced to death by the British authorities. Her sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment because of her gender. She famously told her captors, "I do wish your lot had the decency to shoot me." Advice attributed to her was, "Dress suitably in short skirts and strong boots. Leave your jewels in the bank and buy a revolver." Story 73. Claudette Colvin was a 15-year-old who refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white person 9 months before Rosa Parks. But civil rights leaders did not want their figurehead to be a teenager and cited other reasons. Story 74. Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman to obtain a medical degree in the United States. She graduated from Geneva Medical College, class of 1849, which is now Hobart and William Smith Colleges. Hobart and William Smith Colleges and Seneca Falls do not receive enough attention for their important role in the women's rights movement. Story 75. Longtime lurker, first-time poster, in honor of my 14-year-old daughter who always introduces me to fascinating women in history. I give her full credit for teaching me about Mary Leakey. Mary Leakey was a paleoanthropologist who lived from 1913 to 1996. She discovered the Laetoli site and its ancient footprints. She identified 15 species of animals. While working with her husband on a day he was ill, she went into the field and discovered the first proconsul skull. She was responsible for the discovery and naming of a new genus, Zinjanthropus, also known as the Nutcracker Man. Her husband and son often received much of the credit, but she was the driving force. Story 76. Jackie Cochran contributed more to aviation than Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh combined. Story 77. Every woman who was not a monarch, to be honest? How many suffragettes can you name? How many do you think it took in the United Kingdom? When we look back at history, it is easy to assume events would have happened sooner or later anyway. But they did not happen by some inevitable tide. They were made by real people. Those real people are the ones overlooked in the history books. History is not the rocks visible in the stream. History is the stream. The same is true for men and for the civil rights movement. Story 78. Katherine Johnson was one of the first African-American mathematicians to work for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. She calculated trajectories for the Apollo missions and developed the backup procedures that ensured the safe return of the Apollo 13 astronauts after the incident, often remembered by the words, "Houston, we have a problem." Story 79. Viola Desmond was a businesswoman and civil rights activist. In 1946, her car broke down, and while it was being repaired, she went to a movie at the Roseland Theatre in Nova Scotia. She refused to leave a whites-only section of the theater and was arrested and convicted without legal representation for a tax offense. In recent years, her image was placed on the Canadian $10 bill. Story 80. To the woman who gave me a free mini popcorn chicken at Kentucky Fried Chicken when I was 9, I saved my $10 and rode my bicycle halfway across town for that kid's meal. I still remember you and treasure that kindness to this day. That was about 14 years ago. You inspired me to show kindness to others, and acts of kindness are often overlooked today. I hope you are well and happy. Story 81. Eliza Schuyler Hamilton has received more recognition recently because of the musical Hamilton, but she truly deserves much more credit. If you want details about her accomplishments, look her up or listen to the song, Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story, from Hamilton. She lived a long life for someone who lived during the late 1700s and early 1800s when medical care was limited. Widowed in her 40s, she lived about 50 more years after her husband died. Story 82. She was a pirate queen who commanded a fleet of Chinese junks about 1,800 strong and led an army of over 60,000 pirates. She terrorized the Chinese seas for years, and that is one of the most remarkable stories in maritime history. Story 83. Aspasia of Miletus is thought to have taught rhetoric to Socrates. She was the consort of Pericles, the mother of his son, ran an influential salon in Athens, and is credited with helping shape the Athenian city-state's rhetorical culture and organization. Story 84. Aspasia, a Metic, was a Greek woman around 400 BCE and an accomplished philosopher in her own right. She is said to have tutored Socrates. It is likely that both Plato and Plutarch were intimidated by her and portrayed her harshly in their writings. Story 85. Emily Davison died by suicide when she stepped in front of the king's horse during a race to protest women's suffrage in England. It was filmed because she chose to do it where a news camera was set up. Story 86. Dr. Joan Simpson was the first woman to earn a Doctor of Philosophy degree in meteorology. Her research was instrumental in advancing understanding of hurricanes, and she developed one of the first cloud models. Here is an article from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration detailing her work. Story 87. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen Consort of France and England. She did not invent anything groundbreaking or make any scientific discoveries, but she was unapologetically herself in a time when that was not acceptable. When she died in 1204, she was over 80. She married twice, wore makeup, and raised 10 children, including 3 kings: Richard the Lionheart, Henry the Young King, and John Lackland. She was a trusted advisor to many monarchs and a revolutionary in her own way. Story 88. Ida B. Wells was a journalist, an anti-segregation and anti-lynching activist, a founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and a candidate for the Illinois State Senate in 1930. Story 89. Decca Mitford is my personal hero. She came from an upper-class British family with 6 daughters and 1 son, who died in World War II. The daughters were Nancy, Pamela, Diana, Unity, Jessica known as Decca, and Deborah. All but Pamela were pivotal figures in history to some degree, and in some cases for the worse. Nancy was a writer and biographer. Pamela was devoted to horses. Deborah, known as Debo, was the Duchess of Devonshire and opened the estate Chatsworth to the public to generate funds for upkeep. Diana and Unity were both Nazis. Unity was born in the Canadian town of Swastika and had the middle name Valkyrie. She was a close personal friend of Adolf Hitler and shot herself in the head on the day Germany and Great Britain declared war. She survived, was taken back to England, and died several years later. Most conspiracy theories about Hitler having a secret child revolve around Unity. Diana married Oswald Mosley, the head of the British Union of Fascists. Decca was a communist from an early age. At 17, she ran away to cover the Spanish Civil War with her first husband, who was also her cousin. The couple later went to the United States of America so her husband could fight in World War II. He died the same year their daughter Dinky was born, after their first daughter had died in infancy. Dinky later married civil rights leader James Forman and is the mother of author and Professor James Forman Jr. Decca wrote The American Way of Death, a critique of the funeral industry, and a memoir, Hans and Rebels. She renounced the privileged world she was born into and had an innate sense of justice, while also being very funny and cutting in her indictments of exploitation. You cannot always change the world, but at least you can embarrass the guilty. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.